For those of you who may be new to DCPL, we are a citywide nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving and protecting the historic built environment of Washington, D.C. since 1971. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors whose annual financial support helps underwrite public programs like this one today. They are Denton's, Douglas Development, Antunovich Associates, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Buyer Blinder Bell, EHT Traceries, and KCE Structural Engineers. Many thanks to you all for your dedication to historic preservation in Washington, D.C. So before the presentation begins, I just want to share a few notes about how our program is going to work today. So please use the Q&A box found at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions of our presenter. I will collect your questions at the end and verbally ask them of our speaker following her presentation. And for those of you joining us on Facebook, DCPL's Executive Director, Rebecca Miller, will be monitoring the comment section there and will pass along your questions to us as well. So with that, I am pleased to introduce you all to today's speaker. JoAnn Hill is the author of Secret Washington, D.C., a guide to the weird, wonderful, and obscure. She has lived in Washington, D.C. with her husband, Thalamus, and dog, Jackson, for over 19 years. An avid traveler and foodie, JoAnn writes about their DC living and dining experiences, as well as their global travel adventures on her blog, dcglobejotters.org. Her writing has been published in Bella Magazine, Escape Artist, and Triptopedia. JoAnn served as a DC public school teacher for 17 years. So with that, we're going to get things turned over. Oh, actually, first, we have a question, actually. So I'm going to launch a poll question, and please let us know your answer. So the question is, which of the following DC area places have you visited, and check all that apply. So I'm going to launch that now. It's going to pop up on your screen, and please feel free to answer, and we'll keep that open for a minute.
Excellent. Am I ready to go?
Yeah, we have folks answering, so yeah, go ahead.
Wonderful. Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much, Melissa, and everyone else at the DC Preservation League. It's such a pleasure to be here. I've been very, very excited and looking forward to today's event. So thanks for joining us on this beautiful day. And so as you heard, my name is JoAnn Hill. I am the author of Secret Washington, D.C., A Guide to the Weird, Wonderful, and Obscure. This is my first book. And I wanted just to share a little bit more about who I am and just how this book came to be before I kind of go into my presentation. So I have been writing for a number of years. As Melissa mentioned, I've been writing a blog. And then I was presented with an opportunity from a friend who also is a writer. She's written a book. She's based in Texas. So she wrote a guidebook for Texas. She reached out to me a couple years ago asking if I would be interested in writing a guidebook for Washington. And so she put me in touch with her publisher, which of course is now my publisher. And that's kind of how this book and this project came to be. I shared some writing samples and so forth, and we a few weeks later, I had a book contract, and so I began. So I began writing this book in fall of 2019. And this book has really kind of grown a lot during my writing. So when I started to research in the fall, I mean, of course, this was prior to the pandemic, and no one had any idea what was in store for all of us. I luckily did a lot of research and was able to go to a lot of places. And so I went to a lot of indoor places and museums and of course outdoor places. And I was able to talk to a lot of tour guides, go on walking tours. And I was able to also talk with museum curators and docents and historians and the like. Of course, in the spring of 2020, everything changed. And so with that, a lot of my writing then started to shift and change. My book was postponed, as were a lot of books during that time. And so my book came out just recently, April 1st of 2021, as opposed to in the fall of 2020. But the shift was actually quite a nice shift. So because a lot of places were closed and places were closed indefinitely, I started to really focus on a lot of places that are outside, that I could get to very easily, but also that I knew that my readers would be able to get to easily. And so it lends itself really nicely to today's presentation, because all of the places that I'm going to be sharing about today are outside. Of course, they focus mostly on parks and gardens, green spaces, and so many beautiful urban oases around the city, as well as the National Mall and so forth. But it was really nice. And during the pandemic, it was also gave me a lot of, it was just kind of therapeutic to be able to go out, still explore, still find these hidden stories and secrets and off the beaten path places and be able to write about them. But I also knew that my readers would be able to get to them as well, regardless however long the pandemic lasted. So just to give you a little bit of background of that. All right, well, let's get started. So here is a little bit of a sneak preview of the places that I will be sharing about. There are several more that are not on this slide, but all of these areas are outside, as I mentioned, parks, gardens. Some parks and gardens you will for sure be familiar with, like the Arboretum and the National Mall, which of course is not technically a garden, but of course a park. And some may be a little bit more obscure, and some stories, like the Arlington Cemetery, may be a little bit surprising, which I hope you learn some new fun facts and stories about DC. So the first place I want to talk to you about is the Arboretum. It is one of my favorite places in all of DC. I live very close to the Arboretum in Northeast, so we go there quite often. And two stories in my book are from the Arboretum, and they're very different stories. So one is about the Capitol columns. And so the National Capitol columns, of course, are kind of the iconic structures. And when you look up the Arboretum, often these are the images that you see. And so these 22 Corinthian columns, of course, are stunning, and they are quite the sight to see. But they have an interesting story. They actually came from the US Capitol. So they were not always at the Arboretum, and they came to the Arboretum in 1984. And so what happened is that these columns were at the Capitol. And when the Capitol Dome was completed in the 1860s, the architects had realized that they had made a mistake. They had made some errors in their calculations. And the columns no longer were able to support the dome. The dome was too heavy. It was much bigger than they had anticipated. And so these columns, as stunning as they are, were actually left in storage. They were put in storage and kind of forgotten about for decades. It took donors and a benefactress and so forth to really work together to recover these columns, take them out of storage, and eventually they were then transported and permanently moved to the Arboretum, where they have stood since the mid 80s, ever since. But to me, I mean, this story I love just because the columns are one of my favorite places to go to when I go to the Arboretum. And to think that they had been hidden in storage and kind of left behind for the dust to settle on them for decades kind of is fascinating to me. A second story about the Arboretum is the National Bonsai and Penjing collection. And so I am a former teacher. I taught 3rd and 4th grade in DC public schools in Capitol Hill for 17 years. And I have been to this bonsai collection several times on field trips and so forth. But I didn't know the story of this particular tree that you will see on the slide. And so this pine is about 400 years old. And what's incredible, not just because of how old it is, but also that it actually survived the bombing of Hiroshima in 1945. And so this tree came from a residence, and the family and this tree all survived the bombing, luckily. And it's a pretty incredible story. And so in 1912, Japan gifted 53 bonsai trees to the Arboretum to create this collection. At that time, the story wasn't known. So that story then eventually became known to others. And what's amazing is that years later, 2 of the grandsons of the gentleman who survived the bombing. Their grandsons visited the trees later on. They came to the Arboretum and was able to see this tree and of course the collection that was gifted by Japan. So it's a really incredible story. The last I checked is that the Arboretum, of course, is open right now. The bonsai collection, at least a week or so ago, was not open because of COVID, although now that restrictions are starting to be removed, I foresee the collection being open soon. And so it's a fascinating collection. This tree is stunning and amazing and just has so much incredible history behind it. So then this leads me to another park that is a smaller park. It's in Upper Northwest International Park. And so the park at first glance, it is a really nice park. It's quiet. It's surrounded by some embassies and so forth. It's past like Woodley and Cleveland Park. But the thing to note about this park is that this actually contains a clone of the Newton apple tree. And so if you know the famous story of the famous apple tree that supposedly led to Sir Isaac Newton discovering the law of gravity, this tree is a clone of that famous tree. The famous tree is in England, but they created 4 clones of this famous tree. And those cuttings were obtained and planted throughout different areas. The original tree that was planted in the DC area was planted years ago, but it died in the 1990s. But so what happened though, then they planted another clone in 2000, and that tree, which is what you see here, continues to thrive. And so it's just an interesting story about, how scientists were so fascinated by this tree, of course, based on Newton's discovery and so forth, that they went to great measures to make sure that they could clone the tree, take care of it, and continue to plant other cuttings of the tree. So that's in Northwest DC. On the other side of the city, and a very different kind of park than International Park or the Arboretum, is in Northeast DC and Upper Northeast DC, Chuck Brown Memorial Park. So if you are a music fan like I am, whether you're a Washingtonian or not, you have probably heard, or at least heard of go-go, which is DC's, official music. It has been designated as a DC's official music. And so Chuck Brown is the legend who's kind of regarded as the godfather of go-go. And so he is highly revered, highly loved, highly regarded throughout the city. You might have noticed there's some, Chuck Brown Way, and there's murals to him and so forth. Well, in 2014, which would have been on August 22nd, 2014, which would have been his 78th birthday, they dedicated this memorial, Chuck Brown Memorial, to his life and to his contribution to DC and to go-go. And so this park, and it's, you can go to, it's open, it's a small park. This memorial is really fantastic because, as you can see, the mosaics that are on this memorial, they span his life. So they kind of span his contributions and just his fascinating life throughout, his musical career and so forth. There is an installation that lights up and it's a little bit interactive, so kids like to go on into it as well in this park. They actually have, every year in August, they have a Chuck Brown Day that people come and they celebrate, and they have barbecues and they have music, and it's just like a nice gathering. I don't believe it happened last year because of COVID. It may happen this year. I haven't gotten any word about it, but it's just a great park to bring kids and families and, explore, and again, learn a little bit more about the godfather of go-go, Chuck Brown himself. So this is one of my favorite stories. Meridian Hill Park in Northwest. I used to live in Columbia Heights, so I used to go to this park quite a bit. If you've been to this park, the park itself is stunning. There's so much greenery, a lot of space. A lot of people go and set up picnics and blankets and read and walk their dogs and so forth. But you probably recognize the Joan of Arc, this statue of her mounted on her horse and her sword. And so the statue itself is incredible. It's about 5 feet. The sword is 5 feet and weighs about 30 pounds. And this statue was gifted by France, as a women's group in France in the early 1920s. And so about 30 years later in 1932, the sword was stolen. And so it was taken, which was quite a challenging feat if you think about it, weighing 30 pounds and being 5 feet tall. But it is in a pretty precarious, it's kind of precariously held. So you can kind of see how it was taken at the same time. But it was stolen, but it was just kind of thrown into some bushes. It was a little bent, but it was still intact, and they were able to reinstall it. So then years later in 1978, it was stolen again. So for a second time, then it was stolen. And then it was stolen, and it actually wasn't replaced until 2011. So it's kind of incredible. For about 30 years or so, this sword was missing, and there was no kind of intention of replacing it. So it was eventually replaced. There was money by the History Channel and Lifetime Network and so forth that was raised and so forth to reinstate. And in 2016, it was stolen again. So 3 different times this sword was stolen, which, it's interesting because is it just a coincidence? Probably. I mean, it's spanned now over almost 100 years and so forth. So but the fact that it just kind of keeps getting stolen. And so when it was stolen in 2019, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, she actually called out the National Park Services and was like, what is happening that this park cannot protect the sword? And so greater measures were put in place. And like I said, money was raised and so forth. And so for the last 5 years or so, it has been securely intact and securely, it's secured where it belongs, and hopefully it will stay there. During my research, though, of this story, I also learned that just how few statues there are that honor women, not just in DC, but around the country. Lifetime Network kind of came out with that there are probably about 200 or so statues in the whole country dedicated to women. And so when you think about the number of monuments or statues throughout the United States, I mean, it's mind-boggling, and only 200 or so actually paying tribute to women. It's pretty staggering, and something for us to obviously think about, and hopefully will improve. So another place that's in my book is a stunning place also in Northeast, more kind of in the Brooklyn neighborhood, the Franciscan Monastery of the Holy Land in America. And so the gardens, if you haven't been to the gardens here, they are stunning. And especially right now, I actually was just there a few weeks ago. In all of its bloom, it is so expansive. They take care and manicure the ground so beautifully. I mean, it's really pristine and impeccable. It's worth just walking around. It's free. You can walk around and so forth, just to see the gardens and the flowers and the grounds and so forth for itself. They do events there and so forth. And it's, again, it's pretty large. The story that is featured in my book, Secret DC, is not so much about the gardens, but actually the underground passageways that are underneath. And so there are catacombs that are actually replicas of the catacombs from Rome. And so we think of catacombs often in Rome and Paris and so forth. But in the 1800s, a group of monks decided that they wanted to replicate these catacombs so that people could enjoy them without having to travel to Europe and traveling abroad. And so these passageways were actually built underground in the late 1800s, and you can still tour them today. Now with COVID, I have a feeling those tours have probably been paused, although again, there's a chance that they'll probably open up very soon. But I went luckily during the beginning part of my book, when before the pandemic, and the tour is led by someone who works there. They're free. Fascinating. You learn a little bit of history about the monastery itself, and then you go underground into these passageways, and you learn about there are 2 saints that are basically honored there. Saint Benignus, who was a soldier and was killed because of his religious beliefs, and then a child who was sadly became a martyr because he was also killed for being Christian. And so they talk a lot about them and their relics and bones and so forth being underground. They're enclosed in a very safe case, but it's a little creepy. I mean, it's definitely it's dark. It's a little you are underground. You're going through passageways and so forth, but it's also very well done. fascinating and just a really cool spot to go to. So I highly recommend when they do open up, going to the underground. And of course, while you're there, try to go in the spring or the fall, or at least when, when the flowers and the grounds are green and beautiful, because the space is just, it's stunning. All right. Next, we go to the biggest park, Rock Creek Park. And so I spent a lot of time in Rock Creek Park, especially during the pandemic. And the Capitol stones in Rock Creek Park are the items that are featured in my book as an entry. And so if you go through Rock Creek Park and you go towards the horse stables, these rocks are kind of like, they've been pretty much discreetly disposed near the stables. They're not too far within the stables to get to. It's a very clear path that you can go to, although there aren't really signs. So when I went to the stables, I had to kind of ask people and so forth. But these stones are pretty fascinating because they are humongous, but they came from the Capitol. And it's interesting. A lot of the stories and a lot of the history that I found really kind of relate back to the Capitol. So these stones, the reason why they're there is that basically when the Capitol was renovated in 1958, these stones were taken and there was nowhere to put them. It was illegal to kind of dispose them. Nobody really wanted them. The builders didn't know what to do with them. And so they kind of discreetly just deposited all of these stones. And again, they are huge, in kind of deep in the thrones of the Rock Creek Park, thinking like no one would ever find them. And of course, now people do go and see them, but they are pretty abandoned, meaning no one has claimed ownership of them. So Rock Creek Park doesn't own them. The government doesn't own them. They're kind of just there. They're going to stay there. They're massive. Some are really well still intact, and some of them are, broken and so forth, but they are enormous. And they're kind of, it's just interesting that builders would go to such great lengths to kind of hide them, and no one's still really wanting to take ownership of these huge stones that have a big part of history. So this is a fun park, and it's funny. This is one of my dad's favorite entries in the book, which, it's interesting when you talk to people and you ask them which stories resonate, and everybody has a different answer for different reasons. So if you are a fan of Sonny Bono, which my father is, then this small park, and it is a very, very small park in DuPont Circle, it's very easy to pass by, is a memorial park dedicated to him. And so this plaque, which is on the ground, you can see it says, "In memory of my friend Sonny Bono." And so his friend, his name is Gary Simon. He is a real estate developer and does lots of different projects and so forth. When Sonny Bono died, he decided that he wanted to dedicate a small park in his friend's honor. And so Gary Simon kind of petitioned to, DC Parks and Recreations and other entities to have this small park put in place. And he gave lots of his own money to create this small park. And as you can see from the photo, the park, again, it's very small, it's fenced in. There are some few benches, there's, a tree and so forth. It's very simple, but it's more just to kind of represent the musician, the representative, but of course, his dear friend. Now, something that you would think is such a nice tribute, which it is, did though receive some backlash when it was happening. There were some neighbors and just some individuals in the community who thought, we can't just randomly create parks and memorials for private citizens. Like, where does that kind of end, right? That opens up kind of Pandora's box, and it ends up, where does it kind of stop? But, money buys a lot of things. And so eventually, of course, this park was installed and is still there today. It's, I believe it's on the corner of about 20th and I believe O Street Northwest, give or take, not too far from the DuPont Circle Metro. And so it's just a nice place. It's not somewhere that you probably will spend a ton of time, although, you could, of course, sit on a bench and read a book and so forth. But it's just it kind of reminds you that not all memorials and monuments in the city are dedicated to presidents and so forth, but, also dedicated to individuals who have had impacts in other ways. So this is one of my favorite stories, which is on the National Mall. And so when you go on the National Mall, which of course is much more known to visitors and locals alike, a lot of the places in my book are on and around the National Mall, but more so the backstories or the histories or the secrets behind these iconic places that people may or may not know. And so I did not know this story prior to my research. So on the National Mall, of course, we know the carousel. It's, an iconic structure on the mall. So the story, though, is incredible. And like I said, it's one of my favorite stories. So the carousel was not always on the mall, and it actually didn't come to the mall until the 1980s. It was at an amusement park at Gwynn Oak Amusement Park, which was outside of Baltimore. And so when it was at this park, on the same day that Martin Luther King delivered his famous speech, I Have a Dream, that park, Gwynn Oak, discontinued segregation. And so on the very same day, it was this first day that an African-American child and 2 white children rode on the carousel at the same time, which of course was a huge deal, but also just so much more, such just a much more impactful story because it happened to be the same day that King delivered his famous speech. And so years later, the carousel was transported and moved to the National Mall, which of course is where it still stands today. But that story wasn't known. And so then later it was acquired by private citizens. It's not owned by the park or the Smithsonian. And those individuals actually discovered this story. And so now the story became a little bit more known. So if you go around the carousel towards the back, there's actually now a plaque there that commemorates this incredible story and kind of just how the carousel kind of is tied into the civil rights movement. It's a really feel-good story. It's also, for me, wasn't lost on me that the carousel is situated not too far from where King delivered that iconic speech. So it's just kind of, coming full circle. And so that's just, again, one of my favorite stories. Just it gives me chills every time that I talk about it, and I loved writing about this for sure. So while we're on the National Mall, I wanted to share another great story about the World War II Memorial. And so if you go to the World War II Memorial, and if you go to behind the Pennsylvania Pillar, so right around kind of right behind it, kind of, you have to really look for it. It's kind of hidden. You will see this piece of graffiti. And so it's a drawing, it's a sketch. It looks exactly like this. It's nothing impressive per se. It's not this, intricate, beautiful piece of art by any means. And it actually was created and designed as graffiti. But the story behind it is pretty significant. So the message here of Kilroy was here. These were drawings, and you can notice by the drawing, it's a bald man with a very large nose with that message of Kilroy was here. And this sketch was kind of planted all around the world during World War II, where battles were being fought. And the reason why this sketch was put at these areas, the purpose was to let soldiers know that they weren't alone. So kind of like, you're not alone. You may be scared. You're on the front lines. You are in battle. And but you are not alone. Kilroy was here. Someone is here with you. So it kind of, the goal was to provide comfort to soldiers in combat. And so this graffiti, of course, was put in when the memorial was created and so forth, to kind of commemorate that and just to honor that little graffiti and little sketches kind of went a long way in helping soldiers get through really hard fought battles. And so again, behind the Pennsylvania Pillar, you'll see it. So take a look next time you're there. Am I okay on time? I think so. I think I have a good 10 minutes or so. All right, we get a little dark now. And so we get a little bit more scandalous. So Lafayette Park, which is right near the White House, has a lot of history, One of the historic stories that I wrote about, I thought was very fascinating, pretty dark, pretty scandalous. So if you know Francis Scott Key, he's famous for writing the Star Spangled Banner. His son, Philip Barton Key II, was actually murdered in this park many, many years ago by a congressman. And so you're noticing scandal. So this congressman, his name was Daniel Sickles. He was a congressman, And Philip Barton Key II was actually having an affair with Daniel Sickles' wife. They met at an inauguration and they had this tryst and they had this affair. And so Daniel Sickles, though, was not innocent by any means. And so he was someone also who was known to be a womanizer and had his own scandalous affairs and so forth. However, he, of course, felt betrayed and felt that his family and himself were dishonored from this affair. And so he kind of got word that his wife, Anne Key, were meeting in various places around the city and so forth. And so on this evening when they met at Lafayette Park, he came and he ended up killing Philip Barton Key II and pretty much was said, you have dishonored my family, you must die, more or less. What's even more fascinating about this story is that he was acquitted by the reason of insanity. And so he never went to jail. And actually, this was the first time that this kind of defense was used in the US successfully. And so that also is pretty fascinating. And what's even more fascinating is that he continued, even after he committed murder, to have a very, very fulfilling life and a very successful career. He served in the war. He served as another term as a congressman. And so this didn't really kind of impede his career or his stance as a socialite or an elitist in society. It kind of was like, you were acquitted, and he just kept on kind of, doing what he was doing. So a pretty dark but fascinating story. So we get a little lighter here. We definitely go away from the dark. One of my favorite places in DC. I feel like it's pretty well known, although as I speak with people, I have learned that there are a lot of individuals who don't know of this place. My husband actually has never been here. So this Barbie Pond, which is what it's called, on Avenue Q. So it's on Q Street Northwest between 14th and 15th Street. So about like the Logan Circle area. And what's great about this is it's a couple's home. They live on, beautiful tree-lined street. And in their front yard, they have created this art installation that is using Barbie dolls. And it's a pretty quirky collection. You can walk by it on the sidewalk. It's there. It now actually has become pretty popular that it has a huge Instagram following, and there's they have a TripAdvisor now rating and so forth. So it's become a little bit more known. But what I love about the Barbie Pond installation is it's not just frivolous Barbie dolls. I mean, it's fun and it's playful, but what these artists have done is they've created themes. So about every month or so, the theme changes and rotates. And sometimes they are related to pop culture, or they might be related to holidays. So for example, their display for Halloween or St. Patrick's Day or 4th of July are really spectacular. But also these art installations also promote the political climate and the political scene, of course, being in DC. So during the election, there were a lot of different installations about, urging people to vote. And of course, they do a fun play on, vote for Ken and Barbie and so forth. They did a whole installation about Biden and Harris when they won and so forth. They also do installations that are geared towards activism. And so it's a fun art installation, but their themes are very thought out and they're very meticulously designed. I think what's even more fascinating, at least for me, is that the artists, this couple, they've chosen to try to be as anonymous as possible. So most people, I don't know their names. I've reached out to them via Instagram and so forth, and they're very lovely and wonderful and gave me some information, but they don't, they try to kind of keep themselves anonymous. They're pretty isolated. Some neighbors have said that they've never even seen them and they've lived there for years. So it's to me, it's interesting. And I always wonder, when do they make these installations? Are they going out in the middle of the night at 3 a.m. and creating these incredible displays? Because as you can see by the photos, they are pretty involved. They're pretty elaborate. So they clearly take some time to set up. But who knows? I don't know. I love going by. Whenever I leave with a smile on my face because I'm just so floored by the creativity, the ingenuity, and just their messages are just really good, feel good messages. Okay, so we leave DC now, and the next last places are more now outside of the city for the most part. So Arlington Cemetery, of course, is well known and visited by locals and visitors and so forth. But what's fascinating that I found, I actually have two stories about the cemetery, the Arlington Cemetery, in my book. I wanted to highlight one of them to go along with the theme of parks and gardens and so forth. So Arlington Cemetery, not the entire cemetery, of course, it's massive, but a part of the cemetery actually was a former garden, and not just a garden, but Confederate General Robert E. Lee's garden. So his estate was here, and he had a big garden. And so during the war, during the Civil War, when he left, there were soldiers and so forth, and they wanted to pretty much drive Lee out of his home. They wanted him not to return after the war. And so the area became a national cemetery. It was acquired by the government. It became a cemetery. And so what these soldiers and what the government really did was they started to bury fallen soldiers around Lee's Rose Garden. And actually 26 graves of fallen soldiers were buried there. And the whole point was to deter him from coming back to recoup his land after he came back from the war. And so you can see that that's a pretty drastic move, right? I mean, they took drastic measures so that he would not return to take his land. And there's stories based on my research that he actually was planning to come back and was considering digging up these graves and so forth, which you can only imagine. But of course decided against it and eventually went to Virginia, or further in Virginia and Lexington and so forth, and never actually reclaimed his land. But I mean, how incredible. I just can't imagine today, in 2021, this ever happening. But yeah, part of the cemetery was Lee's former rose garden. So very, very calculated, very spiteful, but also, of course, it worked out for them. So here we go. Another place in Virginia, right next to Ronald Reagan National Park, is Gravelly Point Park. If you know Mount Vernon Trail, I bike Mount Vernon Trail with my husband quite a bit. It leads you through Gravelly Point Park. And so Gravelly Point Park is a popular place that families go to, dog walkers go to, people, throw Frisbees, they have barbecues, they have picnics and so forth. So, but its main draw beyond that is that it's considered one of the best places in the country to view airplanes taking off and landing. And if you've ever been there when a plane is taking off, it is incredible. I mean, it is so close. You feel like the plane is literally hovering about 5 feet above your head. I mean, that's how close it is. And so if you are anyone, or you know of anyone who loves planes, is into aviation, or just enjoys, being outside, this is a great place to get to enjoy a day, but just to see the planes coming in and out is incredible. I never get tired of it. Like I said, I go pretty often, and I'm always pretty stunned and floored, and it's just a sight to see. And it's great, family friendly as well. And this is the last feature of my presentation before we go to Q&A. So I did not know about this amazing farm. It's in Ellicott City, so it's a little farther out. And Ellicott City is pretty much the farthest place I included in my book. There's another place in Ellicott City as well that's in my book of a ghost town called Daniels. But this farm, Clark's Elioak Farm, okay, let me go back. So the reason why this farm, and it is a farm, there's a petting zoo, there are horses, they have produce, they have flowers and so forth. So it is a working farm people go to, and it's very popular. I actually was just there on Saturday. I did a book event there, and it's a wonderful, wonderful space. And it's a great family friendly space, of course. But the reason why they're noted in my book is that if you notice the shoe, and actually this huge shoe is also on the cover of my book. This is one of about 24 or so fairy tale scenes and characters and so forth that were revived. So what happened was, in 1955 in Ellicott City, there was this amusement park called Enchanted Forest, and it was a really big amusement park at the time. They would welcome up to almost 300,000 people every summer. But then, of course, as years went on, big amusement parks like Six Flags, Disneyland, Disney World, all those kind of big conglomerate parks came in and became much more popular. And unfortunately, as with so many other organizations and entities, they could no longer survive and they closed down. And so the big draw to this Enchanted Forest were these story-themed park, old man in the or old woman in the shoe and the three bears and so forth. So many years later, the park was closed for about 30 years. Clark's Farm decided that they wanted to refurbish and revive a lot of these structures. And so what they did was they slowly started to transport these structures over to their farm to refurbish and of course revive and kind of bring back these structures that were so meaningful to so many families and kids, when they were growing up. And some were obviously easier to refurbish than others. Some were so big that they had to cut in half to be able to transport and so forth. And so when you go there now, there are some that are big that pay homage to, Goldilocks and the Three Bears and so forth. Some are huge that kids can kind of enter in and so forth, and some are not. But they're really, really cool to see, and especially if you have kids, they are definitely a main attraction. One last note is that the way that I found out about this park is that there's another entry in my book that I did not talk about today that's out in Virginia, and it's called Foamhenge. And Foamhenge is a replica of Stonehenge, the famous structure in England. And so the artist behind Foamhenge, and it's an actual exact replica of Stonehenge, to the measurements and so forth. It's made out of foam. It's pretty interesting. That artist, his name is Mark Klein. He and I spoke at length, of course, because I interviewed him about Foamhenge, about that work. And at the end of our conversation, he was like, you should really look at Clark's Farm in Ellicott City. I did some work with them too. And so he actually, he was the artist who helped restore some of the art pieces that you see at Clark's Farm. And so he was tied to Willie the Whale and another art piece there. So he led me to that. And so I think this book was just so fun to write because so many stories came like this. So many stories kind of emerged from talking or meeting with someone or going somewhere, researching, which then would lead me to another story or another fascinating off the beaten path location that I was like, I need to investigate that. So Mark Klein, the artist behind Foamhenge, led me ultimately to the great people at Clark's Farm and the Enchanted Forest here. So, all right, I know I gave a lot of information, but I wanted to, of course, I know we have some time for Q&A, and I hope that you do have questions. I know there is maybe another poll that might come into the mix, Melissa, about maybe some favorite places that people have gone to and other places that they may want to go visit that they haven't explored. But I also wanted to share my information if you wanted to learn more about the book, learn more about me or future events. This is my website, secretdcbook.com. That's a really great resource in terms of book-related things. Of course, you can, if you want to obtain the book, a signed book copy from there, you can. But also I included some stories that did not make it into my book that are featured there. So when I started writing the book, I wrote 90 entries. 84 entries ended up making it into the book based on my publisher and just based on format. And so I had 6 extra stories that I had to really, it was a really hard decision how to narrow down to 84 and not include those 6. So those 6 and some other stories as well and other just blog posts are also on my website. And of course, that's my email address if anyone would like to connect even further. And so I am happy to answer questions if there are.
Yeah, thank you so much, JoAnn. This was really, really interesting, and there's a lot of places I didn't know about, so this was really fun. Um, we do have a poll question. I'm going to put it as people think about their own questions. I'm going to put it out there. So this poll question is: which of the following DC area parks is your favorite? So go ahead and answer that one, and we'll see what folks think. So while they answer that question, JoAnn, we have a question from Juliet.
Okay.
Which is, are the catacombs here used for any burials at all that you know of?
That's a great question. Thank you for that question. Not that I know of. During my tour and just research, no, I mean, like I said, you can still go tour, and they have those two relics of the saints and so forth. But I don't know of any burials. Not that I have learned about. No, but that's a great question.
Yeah. And then this wasn't so much a question, but somebody anonymously commented about the stacked stones. Yeah. They just said, while it might not specifically belong to anybody, they're not up for grabs because apparently some have been stolen. So just keep that in mind, folks.
That's a great observation to make. And when you go, and if you do go into Rock Creek Park and you walk to these stones, you can kind of see, I mean, there are some that are enormous that it would be, I think, really, really challenging to seal. I mean, they are huge stones. But then there are others that are much smaller, right? Almost kind of like rubble. But of course, you easily could, right? You could, there's some are almost like pebbles. But no, they should be kept in its environment, kept intact, not interfered with at all. I mean, we talked about the sealing of the sword. We don't want to, further perpetuate any stealings or thefts. But yeah, they don't technically belong to anyone. But of course, just like you would never take things from nature, to respect and keep them where they belong. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. And then Juliet asked, what state did Sickles represent in Congress?
Oh, that's a great question. I want to say New York. Let me, I'm going to double check really quickly because I don't want to get the wrong information. Yep, he was a New York congressman, and he was a Union general when he went back. So great question. New York.
Great. And I'm just going to quickly share the results from our second question. And it looks like Rock Creek Park was the winner of which is the favorite. And then the Arboretum came in close second.
Yeah.
Yes, Rock Creek Park is wonderful.
I would say those results are probably also aligned with my favorites. I mean, Rock Creek Park, of course, it's really hard to, to argue Rock Creek Park and the Arboretum. It's interesting, Gravelly Point Park, which, because I've lived in DC I lived in Maryland for a little bit, but for the most part, I've lived in DC. I never lived in Virginia. And so for me, Gravelly Point Park was not a place that I would go to often. But friends of mine who grew up in Northern Virginia, when I was writing about Gravelly Point Park, they're like, oh, I used to go there all the time as a kid. And a lot of my friends who have children go there often because their kids love watching the planes come in and out. And so that was interesting for me to see also, like places that I didn't know that much about, or at least, didn't visit often, were popular among some people, and then other places were not. So it's just kind of interesting to see, where places people gravitate towards and where places might be new or just, unfamiliar with.
Yeah, and it was nice to hear like how much of this is also like word of mouth, right? Like you were talking to folks and they kind of led you down some like other paths. So it is always nice to kind of hear, like what other people are discovering too.
Absolutely. And I would say I mentioned walking tours earlier, and I can't stress enough, how fun walking tours are. I love walking tours, especially as people are starting to now really kind of, go back outside and kind of join society again, right? I think walking tours that's a nice way to kind of slowly re-enter the DC world, in the sense that you're still outside. It's nice outside. A lot of them are in the evening, so it's a little cooler, especially in the summer months. I went on a number of walking tours with DC Foot Tours and Scary DC and Off the Mall tours and so forth. I learned so much. Tour guides are such I mean, they are just a wealth of knowledge. I would ask so many questions, and a lot of my information, a lot of places in my book were based on these walking tours that I learned about. So that's a nice way to kind of explore different areas of the city while still being outside and still kind of, getting some exercise and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and then our last poll. So which of the following places have you not been to before, but are looking forward to visiting in the future? I will launch that. And while we wait folks to input their answers, I think we have another question. Well, not a question, but Juliet said she took their daughter to the Enchanted Forest around 1988-89. And it was so fun. And they have photos of them there that include one riding in a miniature car around a track.
I love that. Yeah, when I went on last Saturday, my dad was visiting in town. I hadn't seen him for about a year. And we went, I had a book signing there, and he went. And my dad was blown away by this. I mean, just being out, on the farm and so forth was fun. But all of these structures, I mean, they're really incredible. And especially if you have kids, I can see the draw. It kind of, you revert to your childhood when you're there, but it's a great spot. I did a podcast interview last week, and the gentleman who interviewed me, he grew up around Ellicott City. And so he was amazed that I included this Enchanted Forest in my book. It's like, out of all the DC things, I can't believe you included this. But he was so happy because he had so many fond childhood memories. He basically spent his childhood going there. And so for him, he had that personal connection. And so that was nice too. So yeah, it makes me feel good, when people can when these stories resonate with people.
Yeah, no, that's lovely. Yeah, so folks are answering the last poll, and it looks like, okay, here we go. I'll share that. So it seems like the Barbie Pond. I think folks are going to really be visiting the Barbie Pond. I will be. That sounds so fun.
I love that. And I think all of them are amazing. Some are obviously much more approachable than others, right? So like, for example, Clark's Farm is great, but it is in Ellicott City. And I understand that is, it's a 40-minute drive or so. Barbie Pond, I think it makes a lot of sense. It's also just so conveniently located, right in the Logan Circle / DuPont Circle area. And you also don't need a ton of time. You walk on the sidewalk, it's right there. You can stop. You might stop for a minute or two. The art installation is pretty small, but I'm telling you, every time I go and I leave, I leave with a big smile on my face. And I'm just like floored by what this couple has been able to create with Barbie dolls. I mean, it's amazing. It's a very feel good, quirky place to visit. That's easy to get to. Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. And even the messages that you were like talking about, like the activism and kind of like civil rights issues and stuff. And I think that's really good for kids to see as well, because it kind of translates to them maybe a little bit more easy.
I think their current installation now is about the Roaring 20s. So they're, of course, paying homage to, the 1920s, but so like, Barbies are dressed in flapper dresses and like, it's just like, it's amazing. It's Roaring 20s and, they have, what are those, the noisemakers and the kazoos and stuff like that.
Oh, right.
But also, I think it's also saying, oh, now we're like kind of just, the world's kind of opening back up. And so like the Roaring 20s are kind of back. And so they're just really clever in the way they tie things together. So yeah, check that one out. I don't know how long it'll be there. Like I said, they typically rotate once a month or so. I don't know if there's like a specific day or anything, but it's worth checking out. And their Instagram page is fun too. And you, of course, then can see what the current installation is. Yeah.
So Peter asked the question, so like, why is it called Barbie Pond on Ave Q when it is on Q Street? Was it just like a cooler name, I guess, to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. There was that Broadway show that was very popular. I think it was called Avenue Q. I remember going to. I don't know, and I don't know. I am totally speculating. So this is not anything that I have, backed up with research. I wonder if there is some kind of correlation with that. I don't know. That's a great question. I don't know. I wish I knew. I don't know,
Oh,
unfortunately.
that's good. Well, if they're on Instagram, you can always DM them. Maybe they can kind of provide an answer to anybody who has any questions about their exhibit.
Absolutely. Oh, you know, there's one more thing about the Barbie Pond. There was a neighbor who lived near the Barbie Pond, like right on the street. And when that neighbor left, when they moved out of the neighborhood, they left, and I have this in my book. The neighbor, he left a gift of a Ken and Barbie set with a note that basically said, you know, after 8+ years of living here, I just want you to know that, like, I'm moving out, and I want to say thank you for all the joy you've brought me and the neighborhood. So, you know, that kind of thing is it's a feel good place for sure. So yeah, just thought I would add that little extra fun story.
Yeah, no, that's lovely. Yeah, I think I would love to be an extra neighbor to that. I think that's so fun.
Me too. Me too.
Yeah, and then I guess second place was the monastery, which I could also vouch for that. I've been there. It is very beautiful. So definitely go, everybody.
Isn't it funny? And then you kind of go around, you can go down the steps, which it's a lot bigger than I think that I actually anticipated in the beginning. The grounds are immaculate. I mean, it's stunning. But when the catacomb passageways and they start opening up, it's worth a tour. It's very cool. And like I said, it's free, and it's pretty cool for sure.
Okay, so really quickly, we don't have any other questions at this time, but if anybody thinks of a question following the program, you can always email us, or you can email JoAnn, whichever. But I'm going to put the book details once again into the chat so you all can.
So my website, secretdcbook.com, like I said, that's a great resource and so forth. Of course, the book's available on Amazon, local bookstores. I always love to support local bookstores. I have an event with Politics and Prose next week on Tuesday night. And so they certainly have my book in stock. East City Bookstore in Capitol Hill, Kramer's, and so forth. So, Amazon, of course, is an easy way to go for, and we're all, susceptible to Amazon, but also just supporting local bookstores is something that's very near and dear to my heart for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I just want to say thank you so much, JoAnn, for this wonderful presentation. I'm definitely looking forward to getting my own copy of this book, but then also getting back out there again and exploring all these fascinating places that you shared with us today. So thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us today. And just be on the lookout for future DCPL events, and then also, follow JoAnn on Instagram and check, stay in touch with her and see what other events she might have coming up. But yeah, so our next 50th anniversary program is actually happening tomorrow at 4 o'clock. We'll be having a free virtual home and garden tour of the 3020 University Terrace House, which was just recently designated. So that is free, open to the public. You can learn more about that on our website, and just, stay tuned and follow us on Facebook, on our Instagram, Twitter, and you can see what other events are coming up. But with that, I just want to thank you all again. Thank you so much, JoAnn. This was really exciting.
And thank you. I can't thank you all enough. You've all been so wonderful to work with, and just thanks for letting me come and chat with you midday and taking the time to hear all about these fun, quirky places. And I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And congratulations on your book.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the weather.
Yeah, nice sunny day.
Yeah. Thanks again.